Welcome back to Module 1, Inventing Ohio. This lecture explores three questions. First, what is Ohio? Second, why did Ohio have to be invented? And third, who invented it? The story of the invention of Ohio involves the most destructive warfare in North American history, forcing Native Americans from Maryland to Illinois to band together into mobile, diverse communities with a shared interest in survival. They searched for safe harbors free from European disease, free from intertribal warfare, free even from the pernicious effects of climate change. And they sought to create independent communities far enough away from the colonizing, killing Europeans, yet still close enough to trade with them. In other words, trading with strangers was never more dangerous and never more lucrative than in this period. And trade, as a result, required an ever more sophisticated tool to manage it. To help us answer our three questions, what is Ohio, why was it invented, and who invented it, we'll begin with those sojourners seeking a safe haven amidst chaos and violence. We begin with refugees. So what is a refugee? The United Nations provides us a useful definition, one that works as well describing approximately 25 million people around the world today, as it does in describing thousands of Native Americans who lived in the watersheds of the Great Lakes and Ohio River in the mid-1600s. According to the UN, a refugee is a person outside their country of origin because of feared prosecution, conflict, violence, or other circumstance that have seriously disturbed public order. And a refugee cannot return home and needs sanctuary elsewhere. And finally, a refugee is someone who is on the move involuntarily, forced by circumstances beyond her control to seek a haven from social disorder. In the 1600s, what caused that social disorder? What forced thousands of refugee Indians to move? Three things: disease, warfare, and climate change. Our story today is unfortunately one of catastrophic crisis, a crisis that began with germs. Far more Native Americans died in bed from Eurasian germs than on the battlefield from European guns and swords. In the century or two after Columbus's arrival in 1492, the Indian population declined by as much as 95%. For Native Americans in the place that we call Ohio, that story has a twist. Demographic crisis and community decline began decades before Native American-European contact in Ohio. Why? Because of trade routes, waterways, the basic infrastructure that made the Hopewell interaction sphere work. It now became a conduit for germs. As Indians fled the devastation of the coast, the devastation in the Mississippi Valley especially, they fled along these ancient trade routes and carried with them germs. And if germs weren't enough, there was also violence, in particular the Wars of the Iroquois from the 1640s to the 1660s, perhaps the most widespread and destructive warfare in North American history. And like many wars in human history, it was about a key commodity, that is, access to a natural resource, in this case, beaver pelts. The Iroquois traded mainly with the Dutch, and they traded for items that could confer social status: glass beads, wool blankets, cast iron pots and pans, and of course, guns. Now, the Iroquois by the 1640s had depleted their own territory and needed to change their strategy. The Iroquois trade strategy had several interconnected problems. First, there was the cost of European trade. From the 1630s to the 1680s, 75% of the Iroquois died from European diseases. So the question became, how best can we survive? Well, it turns out that they waged war as a repopulation strategy. That is, they waged war not to kill as many people as possible, but to kill just enough in order to kidnap more people to take back to your village. But of course, then the question becomes, how best can we conduct war? And of course, the answer today, as then, was technology. Get the best technology. How did you do that? Well, you got a European gun. How did you get a European gun? You had to get access to beaver pelts. And you had depleted all your beaver pelts by the 1640s, so that meant you had to travel to go somewhere else to find more beaver pelts. That is, you started a resource war with someone else. Of course, once you got your beaver pelts, then you were back dealing with the Europeans who were not only trading with you, but killing you with their germs. So how did the War of the Iroquois affect Ohio? Most of the battles took place north of Lake Erie, where colder temperatures created warmer, more luxurious pelts than in the warmer climate of Ohio. But Lake Erie played a strategic role. On the shores of Lake Erie, in what is now Cleveland, the Erie Nation were the only people standing in the way of the Iroquois and their complete control of the Great Lakes region. The Erie had bows and arrows, the Iroquois had guns. The battle was over in 2 years, and by the 1680s, the Erie had all but disappeared as a nation. The Iroquois then claimed control over Ohio, but they never settled it. In fact, the territory south of Lake Erie became a war road, moving warriors east and west in a dangerous, violent thoroughfare. So violent was the region that the rest of Ohio was depopulated until the early 18th century. So what happened to the people of Ohio? Why had they fled? The survivors of European diseases fled the Iroquois and their violence. They became war refugees, seeking out safe havens. Many of them fled west to Western refugee centers, new towns created out of nothing, full of diverse ethnicities and languages and tribes. Starved Rock, Illinois, for example, had 20,000 people by the 1680s. Here, people sought ties to strangers in order to protect themselves. They engaged in symbolic political rituals and gift-giving. They intermarried and adopted one another. Tribal identities were in flux. Traditional lines of authority were beginning to disappear. Splinter groups were frequent. If the germs didn't kill you, if the Iroquois didn't tomahawk you, then maybe starvation would get you. In the middle of the 17th century, the Earth's temperature cooled just enough to shorten the summer growing season, just enough to kill off game in the forests. These refugee centers tried to protect not only people from violence, but from starvation as well. Many times they failed. Let's listen to the words of several Shawnee refugees who had fled an Ohio Valley that was not just germ-ridden and violent, but cold as well. They had escaped to Starved Rock, the refugee center, but found it as dangerous as the Ohio Valley. And they knew that the Iroquois would soon attack. So they fled there as well, seeking warmer climates, safer climates away from the Iroquois. They traveled to the lower Mississippi Valley, heading for the Gulf of Mexico, when they ran into several French soldiers. And the soldiers encouraged the Shawnees to return to Starved Rock. But the Shawnees refused. They said, "We are now in the most fertile, healthy, and peaceful country in the world. We would be devoid of any sense to leave it and expose ourselves to be tomahawked by the Illinois or burnt by the Iroquois. Please," they begged, "do not send us back to another land where the winter was insufferably cold, the summer without game, and ever in war." In 1701, the French and Indians who lived in the Great Lakes region pushed back successfully against the Iroquois, and they forced peace. The Iroquois agreed to end the war and abandon hunting territory west of Detroit. Peace meant that the refugee centers in the western lands could be abandoned as inhabitants, the refugees, moved back into fertile land and temperate climates opened up by Iroquois decline, including the place that we call Ohio. So who came? Quite a few people, actually. For example, there was a sprinter group of the Huron, who originated in Ontario, Canada. In the place that we call Ohio, they resettled as the Wyandot. Why did they change their name? In French, the word Huron meant rough person. It was an insult. Changing their name was a way of rejecting French authority. So who else? Well, the Miamis. They reestablished communities near French trading posts and then along the Maumee and Wabash rivers. Who else? The Delawares. They were originally from eastern Pennsylvania, but they were now settling in eastern Ohio to escape the British and the Iroquois. The Mingos. Sometimes they're called the Ohio Iroquois, but really they're a splinter group from the Senecas and the Cayugas and some refugees from that old Erie nation and others. Mingo was an Iroquois word for rascal or bad man. They generally settled in eastern Ohio from the mouth of the Muskingum River to the Cuyahoga Valley. And of course, there were the Shawnees, who settled along the Scioto Valley, but then along the Miami and Mad Rivers in western Ohio. The Iroquois called them a people who speak an unintelligible language. They called themselves Sawana, or person of the South. In the mid-1600s, they had centered in the Cumberland River Valley, but by 1692, the Shawnees had established settlements in Pennsylvania along the Delaware and Susquehanna rivers. Iroquois power and English encroachment into Pennsylvania pushed the Shawnees to Ohio, while trade alliances with the French pulled them west. By the 1730s and 1740s, these refugees had created an interesting world in the place that we call Ohio. It was full of villages of no clear-cut, tribally defined units. It was instead villages of mixed ethnicities, of multiple languages. One British colonist went so far as to call these villages as full of mixed, dirty sort of people. He didn't mean their hygiene. He meant that their diversity, their ethnicities, confused him, frightened him even. Now, to Native Americans, the diverse ethnic makeup of their villages was a defensive strategy. They figured that if an enemy knew that some relatives of theirs lived in that village, they wouldn't attack. So by the 1730s, diversity also meant that there was no one name for the river that forms our state's southern boundary. All of these refugees, each with their own languages and accents, brought to this place their own name for the river that we call Ohio. Its name was as diverse as the population. We can see that fact illustrated in European maps from the second half of the 1600s. Europeans relied heavily on indigenous sources, that is, Indians, to make their maps of the territory that became Ohio, because they did not actually set foot here until the 1700s. So European maps actually tell us what Indians thought Ohio was. Check out this map from 1684, based in large part on what an Iroquois Indian told a Frenchman was the Ohio River. Well, let's zoom in to see. The mapmaker labeled what we would call today the Ohio as the Fleuve Saint Louis, or the River St. Louis, named after Louis XIV, the King of France at the time. But he also took care to offer other names, names that Indians had given him. Neither option was Ohio. For that, check out this river. This is most likely the Allegheny River today, but one of its names in 1684, at least according to one Indian who talked to the mapmaker, it was the Ohio. Now, this map doesn't reflect European mistakes, or even European ignorance. It reflects the diversity of Native American descriptions of the world around them. Local context meant everything. What you called the river depended on who you were talking to and where. For example, the Miami and Illinois Indians called part of the Ohio River the White Drums to describe the sights and sounds of the falls near Louisville. They also called another part Shines a Bright White to describe the limestone bed in southwestern Indiana. The Shawnees would call part of the river the Turkey River to describe the river as it flowed to or from a people they called the Turkey Clan. So how do we get to one name? And not just any name, but an Iroquois name. All of the Indians who lived in Ohio by 1750 hated the Iroquois. They had brutalized their ancestors, and not only that, but they claimed to control the land on which the Ohio Indians now lived. And so they often sold it away to the British. That was in fact an Iroquois strategy: divert British expansion to the west and south of traditional Iroquois lands by selling them land along the Ohio River, land that they claimed to control, but in reality didn't. So why would any Indian here accept an Iroquois word for a river? The truth, of course, is that they did so when it was convenient. The new refugee world meant a change in how Indians defined leadership. Instead of leaders with long hereditary claims to power, refugee leadership meant accessing and redistributing wealth to the village. Where did they find this wealth? Well, they certainly could have been self-sufficient in 1750, but wealth to Native Americans in 1750 increasingly meant access to European goods. Leaders in villages in Ohio had one responsibility: establish a village far enough away from Europeans that daily contact was difficult, for safety and independence, but close enough to trade with them. In the 1790s, American soldiers always remarked on one thing when they burned Ohio Indian villages down. Their houses were solidly built and well furnished with silver cutlery, tea, iron pots, and other Western goods. So Ohio Indians, when necessary, started to refer to the Ohio River because that's what the British wanted to call it. And the British had adapted it from the Iroquois. And in turn, the Ohio Indians adapted to the British because by 1750, the British increasingly had the better merchandise, better goods, cheaper prices compared to the French. And when the British increasingly wanted to move north of the Ohio River, the Indians used that term then as well, accepting it in order to get their point across. Don't cross the river, and by the river, let's all be clear, we mean the Ohio River. So Ohio, both the river and the land, was invented to facilitate contact between Native Americans and Europeans. So what is Ohio? Our answer is Ohio is a term of intercultural and interracial trade and diplomacy. So let's return to the three questions posed at the beginning of this discussion. Number one, what is Ohio? Our answer, a tool invented to facilitate interracial and intercultural trade and diplomacy between Europeans and Native Americans. Number two, why was it invented? Our answer, in order to gain the benefits of interracial and intercultural contact while managing the risks of that contact in a dangerous world. And number three, who invented it? Our answer, refugee Indians.